Let me see if I've got this straight. God is big, like really big, but he's also in the small things. We can't see him, and yet he's incredibly close. His character never changes, but at the same time, we can't predict what he's going to do. He's got control over everything, but we can still make our own choices. He is all-powerful and good, but evil still exists in the world. He's a God of justice, yet he loves everyone and forgives anyone who asks. And all of that is supposed to make sense?
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you again. As Kyle said, we've been out the last 2 weeks. Unfortunately, our family came down with COVID, so we were doing the quarantine deal. We are all doing well. We're great. We're healthy. But I want you to know we were just blown away by the love and support that this congregation showed us. I mean, seriously, it's been overwhelming just how well cared for we have felt by so many of you. So thank you from our family to you for the texts, the calls, and meals, and everything else. It's truly been such a sign of God's goodness and kindness to us just in the last 2 weeks. But it feels really good to be back in public spaces with people again. And, you know, obviously COVID it feels like it's creeping a little bit closer. It feels that way, certainly for us, having just done 2 weeks at home. But with that, we are just, as a reminder, doing some new things. One thing that we've been doing all along is just asking to wear masks while we're in the building. You know, we've kind of made that commitment as a church. And then obviously the temperature checks as you come in. And just a reminder about the vision of that. We want to do our part to be as safe as possible. And it's one of those things where we just want to make sure we keep the doors open. We want to be able to come together into worship and do our whatever we can. And so I'd love for you guys to participate and to help us in that. It's a minor way to just say, God, we are going to love our neighbors well, and that's a minor inconvenience in order to do that and to help create an environment that feels safe for people who may otherwise feel vulnerable. Well, one announcement real quick I want to add to the mix of what Kyle threw out is something that we have going on this Wednesday night. We are launching something that's been in preparation at Forest Hill Church for a little over a year now. It's a new discipleship environment called Learning Communities. We've recognized as a church that for a while now, we've had a missing piece of the puzzle in terms of what we need in order to grow as believers in our knowledge and understanding of who God is and what His Word says. And Sunday mornings, the sermons are great, but there's a limit on how much depth we can get in teaching. Bridge groups, life groups are great, but there's a limit at how much teaching can happen there. And so we're creating a new kind of mid-sized group teaching environment that's going to happen every so often throughout the year called Learning Communities. And this Wednesday night, I'll be kicking off a 3-week study going deeper off of this sermon series about the nature of who God is. We would love to see you there, whether in person, we'll be here Wednesday at 7 in the volunteer hub, or online. You can fully participate in this mid-sized group digitally. You can join the group. There'll be a Zoom discussion part afterwards, just like there's discussion afterwards. So we would love for you to be there. There's a childcare reimbursement if you get babysitters to be a part of it and come in person. Whatever you need to do, this is a way for you to grow in your depth of understanding of who God is. And we realize that this is important. This is important for us as a church because, as Jonathan Scott reminded us when we began this series, God doesn't make sense to me. He reminded us of a quote from A.W. Tozer that I want to reread for us because it's a quote that I think shapes the importance of these subjects, these topics that we are talking through in relation to who God is. This is what A.W. Tozer says. This is what Jonathan shared a couple weeks ago. He says, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Worship is pure or base as the worshiper entertains high or low thoughts of God." What he's saying, what he argues in the book, The Knowledge of the Holy, which, by the way, if you come to Learning Communities, we have a free copy of The Knowledge of the Holy, that book for you. It's great. It's really small. And even if you hate reading, you'll like it. It's good. And what he's saying is that however high your view of God is, that's how far you're going to be willing to go in worship to Him, in devotion to Him, how much time you're going to spend with Him, how much prayer, how much obedience you're going to show to Him. But if you have a low view of God, obviously that's going to limit the ceiling at how much you're going to be willing to give. how much you're going to be willing to walk with him when things get difficult. And so for us as a church, there could be no greater study for us than the study of who God is, what God is like. And in terms of elevating our collective consciousness of who God is and what he's like, I can think of no single attribute that speaks to his majesty and his grandeur, that creates a loftiness of our understanding of him, more than the attribute of his sovereignty. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to dig in a little bit, understanding what it means for God to be sovereign. And while we're going to go into the deep end a little bit, I want you to know that this is kind of a taste that we're going to take a little bit more the philosophical, theological route in learning community. So if you're saying, hey, there's some questions here you kind of raised and didn't answer, Gray, don't worry. We're going to talk about these more in learning communities. We're actually in week 2 going to answer the question, how can God be good and allow suffering? Week 3, we're going to talk about how God can be loving and send people to hell. I think these are questions that people are asking, and they're just really easy questions, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about. But today we're going to focus in on God's sovereignty. And so if you will, I'm going to read a few passages of scripture that set the tone and the definitions for us. And as we do here at Forest Hill, I want to invite you to stand out of reverence for the reading of God's word. There are 3 separate passages we'll read from. The first comes from Psalm 115. Verse 3 says this, "Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases." He does all that he pleases. From Isaiah 45, verses 7 and 9, God is speaking. He says, "I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord," all caps, Lord. When you read that, that's God using his proper name that he revealed to Moses, Yahweh. I am that I am. I am Yahweh. I am that I am, all sufficient in myself. I'm the one who does all these things. Woe to him who strives with him who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Sounds like Shakespeare or something confusing. What he's saying is, woe to anyone who would try to argue with the one who created him. And then he says, does a clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles. There's a greatness to God as creator, which means there's a sense of questioning that is kind of off limits for us at times. And then finally from Lamentations 3, who is there who speaks and it happens unless the Lord has ordained it? Do not both adversity and good come from the mouth of the Most High? These are God's words. You can have a seat. If we're going to try to condense what we're reading a little bit about in these verses and give sovereignty a definition, this is what it would be. Sovereignty is the sense that God is the supreme ruler over all things in existence, and he exercises his divine kingship with complete power, wisdom, and freedom. Sovereignty, or to be a sovereign, is to be a king or to be a ruler and to have a reign, to have control and to have authority over something. This stems, when we read about God's sovereignty, the sense that God is in authority, God is in control over all things because he created all things, from his omniscience, his omnipotence, and his omnipresence. You say, whoa, Gardner, slow down a little bit. Omnipotence. What that means is that God is all powerful. There is not anything in this world or in existence that could ever thwart God's plans. There's nothing that could overcome or frustrate the things that he wants to do. If anything could overcome God's plans or frustrate his plans, that thing would be God, not God. God is omnipotent, all-powerful, but he's also omniscient. That means that God is all-knowing. There is not a stray atom or molecule way out in the universe that God doesn't know about. He knows all about it. He knows ins and outs of everything in the universe because he created it. He sustains it. Like Kelly read from Colossians, all things were created through him, and by him, and for him. God is all-knowing. Were there the smallest amount of information in the universe that God did not know about, it would mean that by definition, he is not God. He's omnipotent, all-powerful. He is omniscient, all-knowing, but he's also omnipresent. What that means is that God is everywhere. He's everywhere. There's not ever a place where God is not there. And that means that as king, as sovereign, that there is not a speck of dust in the universe over which God does not declare mine. Now, there are two things that come from this when we start to think about these attributes of who God is, who he's revealed himself to be. The first reality is that God is the freest being in all of existence. He's the freest being. There is nothing that can restrict the will of God. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. You see, we recognize that we have lots of things that limit and restrict our freedom, right? Gravity is restricting my ability to just go fly around right now. As ridiculous as that is. Oxygen, our need for oxygen restricts our ability to just go float up in outer space without a space helmet. You know, my kids, we recognize our kids, their freedom ends where parents, your sovereignty begins. Or theoretically it does, at least. It's supposed to. We recognize we are built within limitations of our freedom. God is not subject to any of those. He is the most absolute free being in all of existence. And because of that, secondly, what God's sovereignty must mean is that God is the happiest being in all of existence. Can you imagine, students, what it would be like to not have a parent or a sibling to thwart your great plans that you have for the weekend, to steal your screen time away from you? Can you imagine what it would be like for everything that you wanted to accomplish to happen seamlessly? God gets to experience in the nature of who he is a joy and a happiness that's built up into him being triune, but also that's built up in the sense of he is sovereign. Now, my guess at this point, is from reading the scriptures and hearing a little bit about what sovereignty means, that for some of us, we're kind of rising up in defense a little bit. My guess is for some of us, there is a challenge that we are wanting to pose to this concept of God as being supremely in control and free to do as he pleases. If I were to condense what I think are the two biggest challenges that come against God's sovereignty, it would be first this. It's our sense of the sovereign self. Our sense of the sovereign self. You see, we have in our culture at large and in Western culture, we have a view of individual freedom. Philosophers call it absolute negative freedom. That's a fancy way of saying that we believe in general, as a culture, that individuals have the absolute authority to pursue life and live their lives and be whoever they want to be without hindrance. Goodness in this paradigm that we define it culturally, goodness is pursuing that freedom and allowing other people to pursue that freedom for themselves. Sin or evil in this paradigm is to hinder someone from being able to pursue that freedom, to offer any kinds of restrictions. My guess is it doesn't take much for you to think a little bit about maybe how you resonate with some of that, how you have believed some of that kind of philosophy, or how you see it out in culture. I want to give an example from culture that's more close to home with my world. It's from the movie Frozen, and it's the beautiful lyrics of the song Let It Go. Elsa climbing up the mountaintop in this beautiful, majestic moment, sings, "It's time to see what I can do, to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. Let it go." You know, then let it go comes into, and I'm like, that is the perfect example of our cultural mindset right now of the sovereign self. I am sovereign. I am free. And what you don't recognize, as I'm like, my daughters are learning garbage philosophy of life right now. It's like, Yeah, Elsa, you're free, but you're kind of setting off an eternal winter in Arendelle right now. So how's that working out for you? Our sense of sovereign self rises up against the idea that God is sovereign, because what it means is that our actual sovereignty, our actual freedom is limited by God's freedom. The second challenge, and this is where I want to camp out the rest of the time. The second challenge that has been raised for centuries, and that I imagine is being raised in your hearts and minds, or for some of you at least, is that when we start to think about our experience with pain and suffering, we begin to wonder how God's sovereignty could be true. David Hume, famous philosopher from a couple hundred years ago, had what he called the Inconsistent Triad, or at least what others have called it. And this is what it means. The Inconsistent Triad, it's a logical argument. And this is how he put it. He said, if God is all powerful, therefore God can prevent suffering. But the reality is, pain and suffering exists in our world. So therefore, God is either not all powerful or he's not all loving. For Hume and others, end of story. Incompatible. There is no God. Basically what he's saying is, if God is powerful enough to rid the world of suffering but chooses not to, then he must not actually be good. Or if God would choose to rid the world of evil but simply can't, then he must not be all powerful. And you can see the problem that's created with that construct. What I want to do today is not deal necessarily with the philosophical, kind of abstract theological questions here. These are important questions, and there are some good answers to them, and that's why we're going to dig into them deeper in learning communities. But today I want to move it down a slightly different direction. You see, I think for most of us, when we recognize this tension between God's goodness and God's sovereignty, what we're after really is not just abstract philosophical answers to the questions that we have. I think really what we're after is the question of, if God is really sovereign like that, can I actually trust that he is good? Can I actually trust him? And it creates a tension. I'm intentionally using the word tension instead of problem, because a problem is something that there are two things in conflict that have to be fixed. But God's attributes are never in conflict. There's never a problem between God's sovereignty and his goodness. There's never a problem between God's love or his holiness. They all work in a beautiful, complex unity within God. That's the mind-blowing aspect of who God is. But for us, on this side of things, it creates a tension. You see, a problem is something that needs to be fixed, but a tension is something that needs to be lived in. And for us, we have a tension because we also read, we read the scriptures about God's sovereignty, but we also read about God's goodness. Hear what the psalmist says. He says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. The Lord is good to all, the psalmist says in 145:9. He has compassion on all he has made. Psalm 34:8, taste and see that the Lord is good. How happy is the person who takes refuge in him? If God is the freest and happiest being, then how happy are we when we preside and abide in him? So a tension's created when this question comes up. Because here's what I know. I know that every single person in this room, from the youngest to the oldest, we have a recognition that the world is not as it should be. Each and every one of us has a recognition. Some of us more of a recognition through our own personal experiences and tragedies that this world is broken, that there is such a thing as evil, pain, and suffering. And so the question that I want to help us answer today is, if God is sovereign, then how can we trust that he also is good? You know, if you think about how you could learn to trust another person, just in everyday relationships, I think there are two pretty simple ways that we all kind of do out of habit. We don't think about it. The first is this. If we're trying to learn how to trust a person, then we're going to listen in to stories that other people tell about the person and the way that they've interacted with them, right? We want to hear about firsthand relationships with that person and what they're like. We learn from that, and it helps guide us into whether or not we can trust them. But then the second way, which is far better, is to get to know the person yourself. to start building that relationship. Well, what I want to do first is I want to show us a story about how God has interacted with someone in a way that shows both God's sovereignty and his goodness. And it's a story that maybe many of you are familiar with. It's a story of a guy named Joseph from the Old Testament. We're still in the first book when we get to Joseph. We're in Genesis. It starts in around chapter 37, goes through the end of the book. And what we start to learn about Joseph is that he is the son of a man named Jacob. Jacob would later be renamed Israel. He had 12 sons who would go on to become and represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel, this is just giving some Old Testament background here. Israel was the chosen people of God. God had made a covenant promise with this people who said, through your family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then on into Joseph, through this family line, I'm going to redeem and restore the whole world. And then we get to the story of Joseph, and we see some interesting things to start to take place. You see, Joseph's father, Jacob, had a couple of wives, and one of which he loved more than the other one. You think your family is messed up. You're in good company. You're in good company. And he loved one wife, Rachel, more than he loved the other one. But the problem was Rachel was struggling with barrenness or infertility, and she wanted to be able to have children, but she couldn't. So there's this bitterness and struggle that happens. But after years and years, finally she has a son, and that son is Joseph. And Joseph is the second youngest of all of his brothers. He has 10 brothers who are older than him. And what ends up happening, I think probably largely because Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, and because they waited for so long, Joseph becomes the apple of his father's eye. Parents, you know you're not supposed to have favorites, right? Or you're at least not supposed to tell them that they're your favorites and like rub it in the other kid's face. Well, Jacob didn't listen to that advice. Jacob gave Joseph all of the best treatment. He bought him this brilliantly colored coat. He treated him better. He told his brothers, Joseph's my favorite, and he wasn't joking. He was serious about it. Well, what do you think happened with Joseph's brothers? They didn't like that very much. And their bitterness and their anger leads them to scheme a plan where they actually want to kill their brother Joseph, the chosen people of God. And what ends up happening is they throw him in a pit. They decide not to kill him, but to sell him to slave traders who take him down into Egypt. Joseph, a young boy at this point, betrayed by his own brothers, sold out for a couple of pieces of silver, alone on his way to Egypt, a foreign land. You imagine that pain. You imagine that sorrow. He's sold into the house of Potiphar. Potiphar was like a governor in Egypt. He's a very powerful man, and quickly what we learn is that Joseph begins to earn some favor. Joseph begins to oversee all of Potiphar's household. He's gaining significant leadership. I have to think for Joseph, he's kind of thinking, finally, God, this horrible thing has happened, but finally some good is starting to come out of it. Well, what we learn in the story is that Potiphar's wife has the hots for Joseph. And what ends up happening is that Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of trying to have an affair with her. And so Joseph, who had been faithful the whole time, fleeing from that temptation, falsely accused, thrown in prison. For years, he sits in a prison cell as someone who didn't deserve to be there in a country that he shouldn't have been in anyways because his brothers had sold him as a slave. But once again, things start picking up. Joseph interprets some dreams for the king's servants, Pharaoh's servants who come into prison, and he says to one of them before he's set free, he says, hey, when you get out, please tell Pharaoh about me. Just remember me. Don't forget me. The cupbearer's like, all right, yeah, I'll tell him. He forgets. He goes on, he gets out, he's like, I'm free, and he just goes on with his life. And for years, Joseph remained in prison. Until finally one day, years later, Pharaoh himself has some dreams. And the cupbearer, the servant, remembers, oh yeah, there was this guy in prison who helped me. And so they call for Joseph. Joseph comes, he interprets the king's dreams, and what he realizes is that there's about to be 7 years of great abundance in Egypt. 7 years where there's going to be more than anyone could possibly need. But after those 7 years, there's going to be 7 more years of famine and drought. And so Joseph says to Pharaoh, you need to set up people who can prepare the way for the famine and be responsible through it. Pharaoh is so blown away by this. He makes Joseph not just free from prison, but number 2 over all of Egypt. And finally, what we end up seeing happening is that meanwhile that all this is happening, Joseph's family, his 11 brothers, their families, his father Jacob, they're far away in their land and they are starving. The covenant people of God, the people that God promised to redeem the whole world, are starving, and so they're sent to Egypt to look for food because they heard that's the only place where it is. They come face to face with Joseph. There's a really cool moment. They don't know it's him. Finally, he reveals himself, and he offers forgiveness to his brothers. In a time where he could have gotten them back and avenged the hardships he went through, he forgave them. And this is the capstone statement that Joseph gives us in Genesis chapter 50. His brothers seeking forgiveness, wrestling, probably feeling awful about what they did. Joseph says, you planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. What would it be like to have that kind of perspective through the things, the hardships, the pain that we walk through? I want to draw out a few points here that help us to understand the dynamic. Because remember, how do you learn to trust someone? One, you hear about the stories and you learn from it. So what do we learn from this story about God interacting with Joseph? Well, the first thing I think we learn is that nothing takes God by surprise or disrupts him from accomplishing his plans. There is nothing in your life that has ever taken God by surprise. God is not an ambulance chaser, right? He's not running after the tragedy that takes place. He's not following after the accident, trying to clean it up after the fact. There is nothing that takes place that's outside of the knowledge and the sovereign governance of God's control. But the second thing we need to see is that God is also not the author of evil, pain, or suffering. God is not the author of evil, pain, and suffering. Who was it that planned evil for Joseph? It was his brothers, right? His brothers were the ones who caused the evil to come about for Joseph. God did not inspire it. He did not instigate it. He did not influence it. The brothers, out of their free choice, made the decision to create that evil. God is not the author or the creator of sin. I know for some of you today, you're walking in, and I know because we've been in these places, you're walking in and you're in the middle of a painful moment in life. And to start talking about God's sovereignty, I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be on that side and to start thinking, are you telling me that God is the one who's creating all this in my life? Because if you are, then I'm out. I'm done. I'll never forget walking through a season of pregnancy loss and infertility that we walked through several years ago. And the pain and the anguish and the question that came through, not just for me, but for my wife, in this searching of, God, how can you be sovereign but allowing this to happen? This morning, you need to be freed from the perspective that would say God is ultimately in charge of this. You see, God can't be the creator of evil or darkness, because evil and darkness aren't necessarily a substance. It's the lack of a substance. It's the lack of good. Darkness is the absence of light. Can't create nothing. It comes out of our free choices. But third, while God does not cause evil, pain, or suffering, he's powerful enough to use it for his good purposes. This is where we start to see the redemptive threads. You see, way back in Genesis 15, when God made his covenant promise with Abraham, he told Abraham, he gave him a heads up. He said, hey, your family is going to become a great nation. But before they do, and before they enter into the promised land that I'm going to give you, they're going to go and they're going to really expand. They're going to multiply. and they're going to prosper, but it's going to be in a foreign land. And then ultimately, after 400 years, they're going to be oppressed by these people there. And it's not going to be until after that takes place that they're actually able to take the land that I'm going to give you. And it's like, oh, God knew all along what was about to happen. But somehow, the evil that was done to Joseph becomes a part of the plan that God already had. Another truth we need to see from Joseph's story is that the ability to see God's sovereign goodness at work is almost always a gift of hindsight and not foresight. Joseph, at the end of the story, when he had overcome the pain and sorrow, could look back and see what God had done. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Not many of us have the ability to look forward at the beginning point of our struggles and say that, do we? Not many of us have the ability to see those threads working and what God might be orchestrating. When I was in high school, I can look back. I have the benefit of hindsight now to see when I broke an elbow playing football that prevented me from playing baseball. When I thought baseball was what God had for me, was his plan. I was going to go play college baseball, and I had to sit out a year, and then it was never the same after that. What I realized is that opened the door to focus on football, and then football opened the door to go to Clemson, and then Clemson opened the door to meet my wife. And I have the benefit of hindsight now to look back and to see that. But I promise you that didn't change the fact that it was really painful and really disappointing in the middle of the moment. Not all of us have the benefit of hindsight. And here's the hard truth. Many of us will never have the benefit even of hindsight on this side of eternity. There are things that have happened to you or will happen to you that we don't have the benefit of understanding what God is doing in the midst of it. My parents, both of them in the last 5 years, have been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I have no idea why. I have no idea what God could possibly be doing to use that. I don't know that I'll ever see on this side of things how there could possibly be a bigger plan with that. But I know that there will be a day, united with God in heaven, that it clicks. Tim Keller says that on the day when Jesus returns, everything sad is going to become untrue. And somehow everything broken, everything is going to be better for having been broken in the first place. So that's the trust we have when we recognize God's sovereignty. And then finally, because you might be thinking, well, how do we have a perspective like Joseph in the midst of things that were going on right now? And the answer is that faith is the power of trusting God's sovereign goodness even when you cannot see it. Joseph couldn't see it along the way. But faith is the act. It's the decision. It's the jumping into the unknown, the lack of understanding, to say, God, I've seen how you've dealt with others before, and I'm going to trust you. You see, there's another story in Scripture that gives us the ability to have this faith. In fact, there's another son, a son who was the favorite of his father, a son who came and was betrayed by his brothers, who was sold, in fact, for a bag of silver, who was arrested, falsely accused, who was beaten and tortured and ultimately died. And for 3 days he sat lifeless, his cold body in a tomb of stone, and his followers shocked, numb, trying to understand how could this possibly be good. Everything that God was supposed to be doing just came crashing down. But on the third day, life started pumping through Jesus' dead body. And as his body was healed and restored and resurrected, a great truth about the nature of who God is became clear. It's that God and his sovereign goodness is not a divine dictator, set apart in the sky, unconcerned with the harsh realities of what's going on, so long as he orchestrates his plan, but that God himself is the one who in Jesus enters into our suffering, who takes it upon himself and who redeems it, so that we can say with the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. You see, when you have the confidence of knowing who God is, trusting in who he is because of how we see him revealed in Jesus, then the question of God's sovereignty, the question of if we can trust him, becomes really clear, because he's not one who's far apart, but he's one who's close to us. He's one who actually walks with us through our suffering. And not only that, he's the one who achieves through the worst things, death on a cross. And he makes that the symbol and the marker of salvation. To use Joseph's words, what the enemy meant for evil, God used for the salvation of the many. I know that today we are coming out of a year that was hard, going into a year that still kind of hard. We all have our own personal tragedies and stories of pain. And this morning, I wonder what would happen if before you got all of the answers to your questions, I wonder what would happen if before you had all of the intellectual doubts answered, if you could say, on the basis of the stories you've heard revealed about who God is, if you could say, I don't understand him, but I trust him. If you could say that in the middle of this diagnosis I just got, in the middle of this conflict with my child that I wish wasn't happening, in the middle of this job situation, I don't understand, but God, I trust you. You see, that is the big question for us. Can you trust in a God that you don't understand? There are two ways to get to know and trust someone. One, you hear the stories. But two, you get to know the person for yourself. And for some of us in this room today, the questions have been our way of putting God at arm's length personally. The questions have been our way of saying, God, I don't want to walk into the unknown of trusting you in the midst of all of this because it's too hard. If God can bring salvation for the many through Joseph's prison experience, through his being sold into slavery, what could God be working? What redemption could be on the other side of the pain and the suffering that you're facing? What story could he be writing? Because the truth is, for all those who love him, there's a story of redemption that's being written. There is no pain in your life that is being wasted. In God's sovereign goodness, he may not dictate and determine that bad things happen, but he will use it for good. And he will not allow his children to be harmed unnecessarily by the evil in this world. He is sovereign and he is good. As we close our service today, we're going to sing a song, and I hope it's a song that brings you to a point of just declaring and stepping into this trust of saying, God, I don't understand maybe, but there's a grander God of who you are that I don't understand. There's a mystery that I want to enter into where I can trust that the things I've experienced are not wasted. That God, you are bringing and using all things for good. And I will invite you as we sing this together to just ask in your heart, am I today trusting in a God that I don't understand? Father, my words are so little. They're so weightless compared to who you are. My ability to paint a picture of your sovereignty and your goodness falls exceedingly short. But God, just a taste, just a glimpse of who you are is enough to change the course of our lives and how we handle ourselves and how we handle trials forever. And I pray that in this moment, God, it wouldn't be my words, but that God, you yourself would just reveal yourself. You would show yourself to these people here today, that you are not just sovereign, but you are good. Oh, you're so good, God. And that for those of us who trust you, who love you, the promise is that nothing is wasted. So God, hear our worship now. And God, I just ask that you would lead us to trust in you.